going gray, and they're only getting better.
Hey, Speech 111. Thanks for showing up. This is Speaking with Visual Aids, Chapter 15. And this PowerPoint and lecture accompany the public speaking text for our class by Zarefki and Ingalls. This is one of my favorite units, and I look forward to doing it with you every semester. In this unit, we'll specifically examine benefits and possible drawbacks of using visual aids in a speech, categories of visual aids and when they're most helpful, some guidelines for preparing and using visual aids. So let's get going with some basic ideas first. They aren't needed in every single speech. So that's one thing you need to remember, although they are required in our informative and persuasive speech. They might distract the audience from the message. I mean, this guy is absolutely adorable, right? But he's a little distracting because he's not necessary. But visual aids are expected in some speaking situations, and we need to be sure that we always face the audience when we're using our visual aids. It's really easy to focus on the visual aids. All right, so those fundamental ideas taken care of, let's preview some of the benefits of these things. They have the capacity to add interest, boost your credibility, add to audience comprehension, and bolster arguments. So we'll talk a little bit more about each one of those ideas. This gives the audience something to look at. Our visual aids are giving them somewhere to focus their eyes. If our delivery isn't getting the job done, this can substitute, but hopefully it complements. It doesn't distract. Visual aids also add some variety so that we're not just talking heads. With some topics, you can really evoke emotion that works in your favor with your images. And finally, visual aids can help engage active listening. So that's the benefit of interest. The next benefit is credibility, and well-designed aids really can create a positive impression in favor of the speaker, and that's a big deal, right? The thing is that if the visual aids are lousy, poorly executed, or inappropriate, they can also damage the speaker's ethos. So that's no good. And you can see here in this Dilbert slide, I can't take you seriously because there's a typo in your deck. You've lost all credibility because of your sloppy presentation. And don't mention my wife in your slide. That's Wi-Fi. So of course the idea is that the character wasn't reading the slide and the slide was accurate, but in this case the audience took it and did something backwards with it. So credibility, interest, and a third benefit is that it enhances comprehension and retention, and we know this from educational psychology and instructional communication. If a visual accompanies a message, the message is more likely to be recalled. This is huge in learning. They can make things more concrete and make comprehension faster. We also said earlier that variety is helpful in visual aids, but it plays a specific role in helping retention and learning. Now, all of that said, we need to know that there are three paths to the brain when it comes to learning. One is tactile-kinesthetic, one is auditory, and the third is visual. If we use visual aids when we're speaking, it helps the audience learn, and there is almost always some learning component to being in an audience for a speech, even if it's entertaining speech. The aid on this slide of the brain is great because it uses color and different typefaces to help the brain separate the areas of the brain by function. And if this were the focus of our conversation, these symbolic values of color and different kinds of fonts could be really helpful. So, and of course we said they add variety. The fourth benefit of visual aids is that they can bolster an argument, or sometimes they just make the argument for us. Watch this video demonstrate how a visual makes a message complete all by itself. This is a visual about the Civil War, and you can see what was happening in the Civil War by watching the action in this video. Are you watching the casualty number right here change? Watch how the South is rising into the Northern Territories. I'm going to speed it up a little bit so you can see. So this video is a demonstration at the Lincoln Library that somebody filmed while they were there, and it turns out to be a really powerful way of demonstrating what happens when a video makes a point by itself. So here's a recap of the benefits of visual aids. They can create interest. They have the potential to build credibility, help the audience's comprehension and recall, and finally add to or stand alone in an argument. No wonder we're gonna use visual aids, because they make a huge difference in the effect of a message. Those are the reasons, right? Oh, what in the world are the visual aids that we're talking about? Charts is where we begin, and the rest of the preview there is graphs, representations, objects, and models. And then the last category is people. So these are the 5 categories of our visual aids. Let's take a look at what makes charts effective. They're used to simplify complex information. So that's the reason we should use them. A series of simple charts is better than a complex one. Remember, visual aids are designed and created to help simplify information for the audience, not make it harder. We want to avoid including too much information, which is a theme that you'll see throughout this lecture. And any statistical chart especially should illustrate only one point. So those are our guidelines for effective charts. Let's take a look at defining charts and a couple of different kinds of them. The first one is a sequence of steps. And this one is to take steps of a process you're including in your speech and put it into words. These are good for simpler sequences. Depending on your topic and audience, you may want to reveal one step at a time as you demonstrate, essentially progressing through the speech with your chart. We'll get some examples of charts and these, actually all 4 categories of charts, in just a moment. Flowcharts also show a process, but by using shapes, and more specifically using shapes, they do this because they show where decision points are in a process. Each symbol represents a specific type of step in a process, and they're very popular in businesses where processes keep them efficient and keep their costs down and their profits up. We'll see an example of a flowchart in just a moment as well. Visual lists are the third kind of chart, and they're exactly what you imagine. They simply give visual support to a list the speaker is sharing, much like the visual aid on this slide. And the fourth type of chart is a statistical chart, and they have the capacity to be the most complex, which is why we have that rule about making sure to convey only one point per chart. Just saying the word statistics can evoke angst in people sometimes, so making them simple is crucial. And remember that visual aids should always be explained, but especially statistical charts, we should never assume that the audience understands the visual aid we have put in front of them. So let's look at a couple of examples of these chart categories. The first one is a visual list. This would be just a list. You might classify it as a simpler statistic chart, but I've highlighted this section because the whole point was to say, hey, look, if you draw attention to these specific pieces, then you might notice you didn't even look at what was underneath it. And it would be really easy to say that even in the countries where we have the highest child mortality rates from 1960 to 2016, even the highest ones have gone down. So it would be easy to make your point that way. In slide 15, we have a much more complex statistical chart, and there's way too much data on it. It might be useful if you highlighted a point, but generally speaking, this is an example of what not to do. Here's a statistical chart that is a simple table. It shows a common statistic called R of an effect size and says how reliable that statistic is with the column P. And somebody who was familiar with this technical lingo would be very comfortable with this. The chart points out the relationship between students who are Machiavellians and their primary motives for communicating with instructors. Essentially saying that if you are a Machiavellian, most of the time your reason for interacting with a teacher based on the categories studied in this research are very functional. You have a reason, you just need to understand something. So this chart is statistical and effective and appropriate because it's simple. Our last example of a chart is a traditional flow chart. Recall that in this type of charts, shapes represent different steps. Those symbols represent actions. This diamond represents a decision point. A rectangle represents just a step in the process. And this funky rectangle with the wavy bottom represents a document that has to be checked or accessed in the process. So they're very specific, and there are people who actually do flowcharting for a living. It's so high end now. So those are charts, and that's the first category of visual aids. The second type of visual aids is graphs, and these are great to show how change in one thing is related to change in another. So they're all about showing relationships, and we're going to examine 3 types of graphs as we move through this unit. The first type is line graphs. Information is plotted on X and Y axes, and you can use these to show complex or simple information, but of course simple is better. This example shows how crimes change as the temperature changes. So temperature's on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have average reported crimes per hour. And if you didn't know this before, as temperatures go up, crime increases. So that's why you might see more of that kind of sort of impulsive crime in the summers. Bar graphs are a second kind, and they illustrate quantity and category very well. The length of the bars is what makes them a powerful and easily understood visual aid, because quickly you can reference what's gotten the most and what's gotten the least and make those comparisons. Here's an example of a bar graph I made last semester based on the number of people who like different types of movie categories. Very simple, very, very simple. You still use your X and your Y, but your graphs represent your categories. Your bars represent your categories. So we have line and bar graph, and the third kind is a pie graph. These are fabulous tools for showing proportion or ratio. How many of a greater whole is shown by the size of the slice of the pie. So here, this comes from the Census Bureau, and oddly enough, we're doing the census now. The federal government says this is where their dollars go based on the census. So it's a portion of the total amount of money. So the 3 types of graphs that we use in public speaking or generally anything are line graphs, bar graphs, and pie graphs. Representations are the third category of visual aids, and they're various visual portrayals of reality. That's how we define representation. A various visual portrayals of reality. And we'll examine 4 or 5 of these now. The first one is textual graphics. These are visual displays of text that convey the meaning of the word in the artistry of the letters. So Friday, and then fireworks kind of looks like fireworks, and Compton is done in just sort of the Art Deco arrangement, not that the letters themselves are so Art Deco. And then the word creative, of course, is a sort of paint splatter. So textual graphics can accomplish that very, very well, especially if it's a simple idea. Diagrams are another form of representation, and these are drawings that represent a more complex object, like the sailboat seen here. This one is from your textbook. And these allow the speaker to focus on specific parts of an object and show only what's relevant. So for example, in this diagram, there are a lot of pieces of information about the sails and the mast, but there's not much information about the hull of the boat. So you're able to choose what you label and draw attention to when you use a diagram, and that's one of the benefits of it. 2 additional kinds of representations are maps and photos. Maps are great for topics that require spatial explanation. That's spatial, S-P-A-T-I-A-L, not special, like all of you. And if it's a complex spatial relationship, it's really important that it gets simplified. Don't put more information on the map than the audience really needs. Photographs are another form, and they have the potential to have a terrific impact on the audience, but this can be risky because it can be distracting or it can reveal too much information. Specifically, iconic photographs can be especially powerful because they symbolize so much. So you probably have seen a photograph of former President Bush on the remains of 9/11 the day after the bombing, and he's got his bullhorn and is given a speech from a pile of ashes. That's an iconic photograph. A more historical one is one of a sailor who's bent a lady over backwards someplace just outside of the New York City harbor, and he's giving her a kiss after the war is over, World War II, I believe. So those are all iconic, meaning that they have a lot of bang for the buck. There's a lot of emotion attached to them. Here's an example of a map that tells a story nearly by itself. Look at the title, Maps of Countries Officially Not Using the Metric System. Wow. There's 4 little red spots. That says a lot all by itself, right? All right. Of course, we know that film and video are visual aids, and they have the advantage of adding movement to the presentation. On the flip side, audiences can become fairly passive as they sort of just stare into space or get distracted by them too. Sometimes using film and video requires extra technology, extra equipment, and that can be a risk, and you have to figure out whether it's worth the risk. Memes are another category of representations. Remember, we've now had textual graphics, diagrams, maps and photos, and film and video. Now we have memes, and I carefully chose 2 that I thought would be appealing to you guys. These can be funny and, really build rapport with the audience, and they, of course, spread rapidly on social media. But it is important that they stand on their own, or else they are likely to detract from the message and the credibility of the speaker. Objects and models are typically smaller versions of the actual items. A downside is that they require action from the speaker, which usually just means a little practice and coordination, but it is one more thing for the speaker, right? And sometimes the actual object is better, but models are great when that's not a realistic option. This image is a model of the Sydney Opera House in Australia, which of course sharing the actual opera house would be unrealistic. The last category is people, and this does include you. Do you remember the demonstration speech video of the guy who showed us how to do the Charleston dance? He was a great visual aid. When we use people, we need to make sure that they represent us well. You could also select an audience volunteer or have what I call a ringer, which is someone you have prearranged to be a part of the event or the participation. That works as well. So, charts, graphs, representations, objects and models, and people. That's terrific. But how do we make good ones? That is an important part. I'm going to pause this presentation here so we can make 2 videos out of it, and we'll come back and start the principles of good visual design, visual aid design in our second half. Thanks.
I'm doing alright, getting good grades, the future's so bright. I gotta wear